HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Fall Guy, a novel, by James Lasdun, read by Charles Constant. Chapter 1. Summer 2012. They'd arranged to leave late so as to avoid the traffic. Matthew, trundling his suitcase from the subway, arrived at Charlie's house in Cobble Hill at 7, and helped load Charlie's bags into the back of the Lexus. It was a humid evening, and by the time they were done, his shirt was soaked in sweat. They took the tunnel out of Brooklyn and headed up the West Side Highway, Charlie slowing the heavy vehicle at every intersection to avoid the speed cameras and accelerating hard for the next stretch. All the way through Midtown, the lights cooperated with his progress, spreading green welcomes as if waving some dignitary through checkpoints. Not that Charlie noticed, of course. Matthew observed to himself. Charlie would never deign to notice such a trivial piece of luck. In Harlem, they exited to stock up at Fairway, filling a cart with cheese, olives, artichokes, caper berries. At the last minute, Charlie threw in some tins of Osetra caviar. Best thing on earth for late-night munchies. Matthew shrugged. Charlie was paying, after all. A few minutes later, they were crossing the George Washington Bridge. "Why don't you find some music?" Charlie said. Matthew had thought they might talk, but did as his cousin asked, selecting Gisa King's Debussy on the iPod. "Good choice." After a minute, though, Charlie said, "Actually, could you find something by Plan B?" Matthew scrolled to Plan B. Hard beats and aggressive voices replaced the rippling piano. "Oi! I said, oi! What you looking at, you little rich boy?" "What do you think?" Charlie said. "Great, aren't they?" Matthew glanced over to see if his cousin was joking, but he didn't appear to be. "Not bad." "Needs to be louder, though." Matthew turned up the volume. They drove down the Palisades and onto the thruway. As they passed the Suffern exit, Charlie motioned with his hand that he wanted the music turned back down. "You know that feeling when you've forgotten something?" "Yes." "I'm getting waves of it." "Uh-oh." "But I'm not getting a fix on what it is." "Someone you're supposed to have called?" "No." "Something to do with work?" "Nope." "Family?" "I don't think so." "Maybe it's just a phantom version of the feeling." "Let's hope." 20 minutes later, Charlie slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder. "It's Chloe's anniversary present. I bought her a bracelet. I left the fucking thing behind." "Shit." "Shit is it." "Can you get it when you next go down?" Charlie shook his head. "No, our anniversary's this Sunday. I can't not have a gift for her. It's our 10th. "Well, okay, let's go back." So much for dinner at the Millstream. Chloe had left that morning to drop off their daughter Lily at the music camp in Connecticut before heading back west into New York State to meet Charlie and Matthew. The plan had been to rendezvous at the Millstream Inn in Aurelia for a late dinner before going on to the house. "We won't get in till 2 or 3 a.m. Chloe doesn't like being there alone at night. She'll be deeply pissed, and I won't be able to explain why it happened without ruining the surprise." "Why don't I go back?" Matthew offered. "I can get the train from Harriman and catch the late bus up to Aurelia." No. Anyway, there isn't a late bus." "Well, I could stay in the city. Come up tomorrow morning." "No, this is my screw-up. I'll get the train down, and you can drive up and meet Chloe. That's what we'll do." "That's ridiculous, Charlie. Let me go back. You need to open up the house, deal with the pool. Chloe'll be much more upset if I show up without you than if you show up without me." "No, that wouldn't be right. I couldn't let you do that." "Don't be silly. Plus, this way you won't need to invent a reason for being late. You can just tell her I had some last-minute hitch and couldn't come till tomorrow." Charlie went on protesting, but Matthew knew he'd given his cousin what he wanted. An excuse to let Matthew fetch the bracelet without it looking too much like he, Charlie, was taking advantage. It would be a matter of purely practical necessity. In due course, he agreed to the plan. At the train station, he gave Matthew his Amex card. "Don't stint on taxis and get a decent dinner. Rucola should still be open, or go somewhere fancier. Anywhere's fine. I like rucola. Also, you can sleep at the house if you like. Lupa'll be there in the morning, so you can just leave everything for her." "Well, I have no choice. My subletter's moved in for the summer." Charlie looked surprised. "Your subletter? I didn't know you'd sublet." "I can't afford not to, Charlie." "Oh, well, great. That's great." "I hope so. The bracelet's in the safe, which is probably why I forgot the damn thing. I never use it." Charlie wrote down the burglar alarm code for the house and the combination numbers for the safe. "I'll have to kill you, obviously, as soon as you get back tomorrow," he said, handing Matthew the scrap of paper. "Obviously." "Seriously, though, tear this up when you leave the house." "I'll swallow it." "And be careful at the Port Authority tomorrow. We don't want you getting mugged with a $10,000 bracelet." "Maybe I should swallow that, too." "That's gross, Matty. I'll see you tomorrow." There was an hour's wait for the train. Matthew had a book, his father's old copy of Pascal's Pensées, as well as the summer issue of Vanity Fair, but he was distracted. After a while, he realized he was actually a little upset. Not about having to go back for the bracelet, but about Charlie's apparent surprise at the news that he'd sublet his apartment. Hadn't Charlie meant what he'd said when he'd invited him to stay for the summer? He could remember Charlie's words exactly. "Come up to Aurelia with us. You can have the guest house. We have plenty of room for other visitors. Stay as long as you like. Stay the whole summer, bro." Matthew had thanked him non-committally, not wanting to snatch too eagerly at the offer in case Charlie should have second thoughts. But a week later, Charlie had repeated it more firmly. "Chloe and I would love to have you stay for the summer. I'm going to have to be in the city quite a bit, and it'll be good for Chloe to have someone around. We thought we could appoint you official cook and grillmeister." Matthew had taken him at his word, appreciating the tact of the little quid pro quo. And since he had no reason to come back down to the city for the period, he'd found a subtenant to stay in his apartment until Labor Day. Now he had to wonder if he'd misunderstood Charlie's invitation. Had his "stay the whole summer, bro" not been meant to be taken literally? Was it what his father would have called just a façon de parler? Well, there wasn't much he could do about it if it was. He'd advertised his apartment 2 months ago, and the subtenant had arrived this morning. A Norwegian art historian who wanted to spend her summer exploring Brooklyn and looking at paintings in the Met. Anyway, Matthew told himself, Charlie hadn't seemed upset or put out exactly, more just surprised. They were first cousins, he and Charlie, their mothers sisters from Providence, Rhode Island. Charlie's mother had died when Charlie was 13. His father, at that time posted at the Dubai office of his bank, had sent Charlie to live with Matthew's family in London. The two of them had gone to the same London private school as day boys, and for a while they'd been close, brothers in all but name. Charlie's return to the States for college 5 years later would have been a wrench for both of them if things had continued as expected. But that had not been the case. Instead, calamity had struck. Matthew's father, a well-to-do solicitor who'd become a member of Lloyd's, had lost almost everything when the insurance giant collapsed in the late 80s. A man of unstained character until then, he'd emptied the accounts of several of his clients and disappeared out of the country, vanishing without a trace and leaving a pall of bewildered shame and grief hanging like a gaseous wake over his abandoned family. In under a year, Matthew, acting out in his own singular fashion, had been expelled from school after admitting to selling drugs. As for Charlie, rather than remain in the blighted Danaker home, he had asked his father to enroll him as a boarder for the remainder of his time at the school, and with Matthew continuing his education at a series of crammers in increasingly obscure corners of London, the boys had soon lost touch with each other. A reprisal of the friendship had never been something Matthew had considered remotely in the cards, or even especially desirable. But 10 years later, circumstances had brought Matthew himself to live in the States, and after some initial reluctance he had contacted his cousin. Charlie, at that time freshly separated from his first wife and still raw from the experience, had responded with unexpected warmth, and the two had become friends again. Still, it wasn't the same as if they'd never had a breach, and it didn't take much for Matthew to start wondering how dependable this newfound relationship really was. He made an effort to shrug off Charlie's surprise about the sublet, telling himself he was being oversensitive, and started reading an article in Vanity Fair about gourmet food trucks, a subject that happened to interest him. The train, when it finally came, crawled morosely toward New York, as if in protest at having to work at this ungodly hour. Just outside Secaucus Junction, it seemed to realize it was about to relinquish any further chance of inconveniencing its passengers, and came to a complete halt for 40 minutes. It was past midnight by the time Matthew arrived at Charlie's house in Cobble Hill. Rucola would be closed. He was too tired to look for somewhere still open, let alone cook for himself. He was fastidious about food and preferred to go to bed hungry than to eat poorly. He chained the door, kicked off his shoes, and went upstairs. It felt a bit strange, climbing the 3 flights to the guest room with no one else there. He'd never been alone in the house before, and had only been in the upstairs quarters once, when Charlie had first bought the place and was showing it off to him. The sleek 50s furnishings that Chloe collected seemed to look at him askance from their blonde frames and naugahyde upholstery. A baby grand in a second-floor room stood with its double-hinged lid half open, baring its antique teeth in a cringing grin. Charlie had said they always kept the bed made up, but in fact it just had a folded comforter on a bare mattress. Matthew didn't feel like hunting up a set of sheets, and he went to look for somewhere else to sleep. Lily's bed on the floor below was made up, but it didn't seem right to sleep in a young girl's bed, surrounded by dolls and furry toys. He went on down to Charlie and Chloe's bedroom. The king-sized bed stood with its gold chenille cover and rumpled satin sheets flung back. It would do. There was a gray marble bathroom ensuite, with 2 sinks and a brass shower head the size of a gong in the shower. He undressed and slid open the glass door, standing under the deluge of hot rain until he felt the grime of his journey cleansed from him. Books on global finance, climate change, Zen and Tibetan Buddhism were stacked on one side of the bed, photography magazines and paperback novels on the other. Naked, he climbed in next to the paperbacks and magazines. As he laid his head on the pillow, he caught the smell of Chloe's perfume. He breathed it in deeply. As always, it stirred a very specific emotion inside him, unnameable but powerfully evocative of its wearer. A short, sheer nightdress with thin shoulder straps lay crumpled on the carpet below the mattress. He picked it up and held it against the light. A strand of Chloe's dark hair glinted on the cream-colored silk. He let the garment slide down softly against his cheek and filled his lungs again with the delicate scented fragrance. In the morning he woke early and went down to the kitchen to retrieve the bracelet. The safe was in the wall behind the refrigerator. Unlocking the casters, as Charlie had instructed, he hauled the appliance out of its berth. The safe's dial protruded at eye level from a metal door in the wall. He turned it to the numbers on the notepaper Charlie had given him. The last 4 digits were 1985, and when he looked again at the other numbers, he realized they formed the date Charlie's mother had died. He knew Charlie had this tender, vulnerable side, but it wasn't always visible, and his feelings toward his cousin, which could sometimes be harsh, softened when he was reminded of it. The steel door clicked open, spilling cold air onto his forearm. Inside, in front of some stacked blocks of cash and 4 bottles of Cipro, was a flat Tiffany's jewel box. He took it out and closed the safe, replacing the refrigerator and relocking the casters. Curious to see what $10,000 could buy, he opened the box. The bracelet was a thick cuff of gold with Tiffany & Co. inscribed along one edge. An utterly bland piece of jewelry, in Matthew's opinion. He felt bad for Chloe, about to receive something that, with her taste, she could only find banal, but which she would obviously have to pretend to like. He put the box in his pack and left, resetting the burglar alarm. It was another day of clinging heat in New York. The Port Authority smelled like a dumpster. But the bus was cool inside and not too crowded, and as it headed north, the foliage along the thruway glittered promisingly. He picked up the article he'd been reading the evening before, on gourmet food trucks. It was a business he'd been thinking of getting into himself some day if he could raise the money. In London, when he was 18, a friend of his mother's had taken him on at the trattoria she owned in Fulham, and taught him the rudiments of the restaurant business. Later, an acquaintance of the same woman had offered him a job in New York, where he'd learned to cook professionally, and one way or another food had been his livelihood ever since. A somewhat lean one in recent years, it had to be said. A curious lassitude had taken hold of him lately, a feeling of being adrift and of not quite having the willpower to do anything about it. He'd had a share in a farm-to-table restaurant in Greenpoint that he'd sold 3 years earlier for a small profit, and he'd planned to reinvest the money in another, more promising venture. But he'd hesitated at the last moment, stayed home in a state of peculiar inertia on the morning of the final round of discussions, and the opportunity had passed. Since then, as if in obedience to some mysterious but inflexible organic law, his field of operations had been steadily dwindling. He blogged about food and made a little money off the ads. A friend at a TV production company sometimes called him up to consult. He was registered with an agency that sent out chefs for private dinners, and occasionally he got a gig. But it was all beginning to feel rather remote, and not just the food business, but other things too. Recently he'd come across the coinage meat space, meaning the real, as opposed to the virtual world, and had found himself adopting it as his own private expression for what he seemed to be steadily, unaccountably withdrawing from, or what seemed to be withdrawing from him. Meat space of worldly accomplishment, meat space of relationships, meat space of money. At 39, he was close, in fact, to living off pure fumes of just about everything. It wasn't something he experienced as a great hardship, but he was aware that the moment was approaching when even the fumes would run out. The bus stopped by the village green in Aurelia, opposite the hardware store. The place was thronged, teens playing hacky-sack, gardeners at work on the riotously blooming plants, tourists milling around with cameras and ice creams. Behind the clapboard and brick buildings rose the round-topped mountains of the Catskills. They weren't majestic exactly, but they were big enough to suggest the idea of a wilderness, and to confer a bucolic air on the bustling little town. Matthew sat on a bench with his bag, waiting for Charlie. He'd been to Aurelia several times before, weekend visits, and once over Thanksgiving. A century ago, an arts colony had been founded there, and the town had been a haven for artists and musicians ever since. In their wake, these bohemians had brought an unusual combination of ragged drifters and well-heeled New York weekenders who mingled together in a curious symbiosis of mutual flattery. The weekenders were of the type who liked to think of themselves as successful members of the counterculture, and the drifters clearly enjoyed the boosted status they got from being the real thing. Some of the stores along Taylor Street, the main thoroughfare, were head shops selling tie-dyed T-shirts and drug paraphernalia, but there were also upscale realtors' offices advertising $2 million homes, as well as a couple of cafes where you could get a decent macchiato, and one good restaurant, the Millstream Inn. After 10 minutes, Charlie pulled up on the road behind the green, stopping in front of the white-spired Dutch Reformed church. He was driving the convertible now, a cream-colored BMW that Chloe had driven up the day before. He was dressed in a white tennis shirt and shorts. His handsome, regular features were already a little sunburned. "I brought you something from the juice bar," he called out, waving a tall cup at Matthew. Matthew took the drink and got in the car. It was a watermelon juice, cold and not too sweet. "Thank you." "Thank you, man. You saved my ass. Everything go okay?" Everything was fine. He gave Charlie the bracelet. "Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate it." "No problem." Charlie grinned at him in the mirror. "Were you surprised to see all that moolah in the safe?" "I didn't really look," Matthew said. A momentary disappointment crossed Charlie's face, and it occurred to Matthew that his cousin had wanted him to be impressed by the money.
I mean, it looked like a good amount.
$1.5 million, Charlie said. Everyone was doing it after 9/11, then the Cipro after the anthrax scare. To be honest, it seemed irresponsible not to.
Totally irresponsible.
Hey, don't mock.
Sorry.
If the big one drops, you'll know where to come, right?
Thanks, Charlie.
I mean it. Leaving town, they wound up into the mountains. The warm air rushing over Matthew's face smelled of summer. At Charlie's Road, they began climbing more steeply. The road, with its hairpin twists, had been cut into the mountain in the 90s when the town first began attracting the so-called little millionaires of the Clinton era. The houses along it were sleek and modern, with irregular angled decks jutting out to take advantage of the view, stone-boarded swimming pools flashing turquoise in their grounds. Charlie's house, on a parcel of 20 acres near the top, was an almost invisible structure in which bluestone, cedar, and glass mingled with the surrounding rocks, woods, and sky in an ingenious way that made you unsure as you approached which part of what you were looking at was natural, which man-made. From the front there was a tremendous view all the way to the Hudson River, across what looked like virgin forest, at least in summer when the billowing foliage swallowed everything but the old church spire. As Charlie opened the front door, Fu, their enormous black chow, bounded over. Matthew found the dog's slobbering friendliness hard to take, though he did his best to conceal it, letting the creature jump up against his chest in his usual over-friendly greeting, without betraying too much distaste. Charlie tried to calm the animal, but Fu ignored him, mashing his wet nose and bluish-black tongue into Matthew's chin. "We're having some issues with Fu," Charlie said apologetically. Stone floors and walls kept the cool air inside. Rawhide sofas and armchairs were grouped in the sunken living room around a carved wooden coffee table laden with Chloe's photography books. Off to the side, an open-plan dining room and kitchen looked out onto the terrace and lawn through a Japanese wall in which glass, paper panels, and wood-framed bug screens could be arranged in combinations to let in different amounts of light and air. On the far side of the lawn was the pool, flanked by the pool house, with the guest house perched on a rock nearby. "I'm going to take a shower," Charlie said. "Go say hello to Chloe. She's by the pool. Your bag's in the guest house. Everything's ready for you." Chapter 2. Matthew hadn't seen Chloe for a couple of months, but even if he'd seen her just a day ago or only an hour ago, it would not have been a neutral event for him to see her now. It never was. He had been trying hard lately to come to an accurate understanding of his feelings for her. A year or so after his father's disappearance, his mother had sent him to a therapist, a large, somber Australian named Dr. McCubbin. The sessions at Dr. McCubbin's office overlooking Hampstead Heath had done little to alleviate the effect on Matthew of his father's actions, but in their own way they had been instructive. Dr. McCubbin had taught Matthew how to analyze his emotions by instilling in him the habit of asking himself, "What does this feel like? Where else have I experienced this particular shade of joy or sadness? What specific associations does it have for me?" He'd also taught him not to be afraid of any desire or impulse he might discover by this process. The psyche, Dr. McCubbin had shown him, was autonomous. You couldn't alter its inclinations however much you might want to, so there was no point in trying. You could, however, avoid being tyrannized by them, and the better you understood them, the easier this would be. In the case of Chloe, Matthew had teased out a large number of disparate components in the general feeling of enchantment he experienced in her presence. Being several years older than her, he had to acknowledge something paternal in his attitude, a kind of protective, delightedly disapproving fondness that he imagined he might feel toward a daughter if he should ever have one. At the same time, as Charlie's cousin and honorary brother, he felt related to her on a more equal, sibling or in-law-like footing. Then, in the tacit arrangement by which it was always as the beneficiary of her and Charlie's hospitality that he saw her, there was never any question of them visiting him in his dismal little one-bedroom in Bushwick. There was also something of the dependent child in his feeling toward her, or at least a projection of something parental onto her. Then, too, there was that very precisely defined and circumscribed amatory interest that the medieval poets understood so well. The attraction of the squire to his master's lady, a matter of devotion on one side and infinite kindness on the other, with the mutual understanding that any favors granted must be of a purely symbolic nature. More prosaically, he'd always felt a simple, friendly affection for her. She'd been a food photographer before marrying Charlie, and knew some of the people Matthew had worked with in the restaurant business in New York. She liked art and literature in the same unintellectual way as Matthew did, and shared his weakness for low-end celebrity gossip. The soft peal of her laughter as the two of them worked their way through the love lives of Lindsay Lohan and the Kardashians, often to the accompaniment of Charlie's snores, was a sound Matthew had come to associate with his evenings at their home in Cobble Hill, and it formed a significant part of the picture he'd imagined as he looked forward to their summer together in Aurelia. And then finally there was that sense of almost supernatural kinship that exists often between people who seem on the surface quite unalike, but whom life conspires to link by a succession of small affinities, creating a bond that exists in a world of its own, requiring neither comment nor confirmation in this world. He'd felt this bond since first meeting her a decade earlier. Charlie and she had just started dating, and Charlie, whose disastrous first marriage left him distrustful of his own judgment, had wanted to know what Matthew thought of her. The three of them met at Charlie's old apartment in the village. Right away, Matthew could see she was in another class from the women Charlie had introduced him to previously. Her clear structural attractiveness, her good taste in clothing that came across as natural elegance, completely unlike the over-groomed glamour of her predecessors, her quiet curiosity and absolute lack of pretension, made him extremely happy on Charlie's behalf. Charlie, who was redecorating his apartment, had just bought some Basquiat drawings, and the three of them had started talking about art. At one point, Charlie had asked Chloe what her all-time favorite painting was. She'd thought for a moment, and then, as she began to speak, Matthew had known with a strange certainty that she was going to name the one and only old master painting that had ever meant anything to him. Bellini's Madonna with Saints, which his father had brought him to see in the church of San Zaccaria when they went to Venice on a trip around Europe the year before he disappeared. "That would have to be Bellini's Madonna with Saints," she'd said, and the hairs had stood up on the back of Matthew's neck. It had seemed to bring him back through the years to the moment when he'd entered the church with his father, both of them wearied and surfeited from their day of sightseeing, and stood together, bound suddenly close in their silent mutual amazement at the monumental slabs of color arrayed across the painting in the form of the saints' robes, each figure in its dissonant brilliance engulfing the two of them like some tumultuous, intensely differentiated type of joy. "We won't forget that in a hurry," his father had said when they finally ran out of coins for the illumination. "Will we?" Not wanting to upstage Charlie, who hadn't heard of the picture, Matthew had restrained his reaction, merely nodding to show that he approved of Chloe's choice. But as Charlie's friend, he'd felt overjoyed that the woman who was so obviously the right woman for Charlie was also, so to speak, the right woman for himself. So now, as he went out through the glass doors across the bluestone terrace with its glazed urns of pink geraniums, over the freshly cut lawn and through the lines of young apple trees planted to conceal the chain-link pool fence, he was in some fantastical sense approaching an idealized composite in whom daughter, sister, cousin, mother, mistress, friend, and mystical other half were all miraculously co-mingled. At any rate, that was the best he could do to account for the trance-like state he seemed to enter when he was with her, in which he felt simultaneously hyper-alert, as if some benign force were commanding every resource of wit, charm, sensitivity, and brilliance he possessed to stand at attention, and dazed to a point of happy unself-consciousness. She was sunbathing on a deck chair at the far end of the pool. As Matthew opened the gate, she sat up and waved to him. "Hello, Matt." Hi, Chloe. She stood, putting a shirt on over her swimsuit and sliding her sunglasses up.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?